And number 4, Thundercat, it is what it is. And this album is what it is. Pure feel good. As expected, Thundercat is an absolute master on the bass, and he's also an absolute master at recreating the classic funk sound of the 1970s, and does so in a way that is just pure feel-good, really laid back, really danceable. It's this album that the instant I put it on, it puts me in a good mood. And it's one of those albums where when I put it on, I can't stop listening to it. That partly helps because it works really well as an album because of how each track seems to flow into the other. So I'll put on one track, and before I know it, I'll have listened to half the album. 2020 has had some great retro-sounding R&B releases from Chloe and Hal, Liane La Havas, and Salt, but I think this one easily takes the cake. At number 3, King Cruel, Man Alive. This album doesn't have a whole lot of change from 2017's incredible The Ooze, but King Cruel is just one of those artists, as with Thundercat, who's just mastered his own personal style, a brilliant fusion of trip-hop, jazz and post-punk. And similar to the Sewer Slut album, it has a really dark, quirky, also oddly laid-back, late-night vibe that when you listen to it just seems to thoroughly absorb you into its weird and wonderful world. And now at number 2, an album that was really close to getting the top spot because I just adore everything about it, every single creative decision. It is Gorillaz' Song Machine. And Gorillaz were sort of in a very odd place when this album came out. Their return on Humans had been hugely hyped up, yet when the album was actually released, it was considered quite a disappointment, particularly in how it had abandoned the genre fusion style that the Gorillaz were known for in favour of focusing almost exclusively on contemporary hip-hop and R&B. The follow-up, The Now Now, was considered a far greater improvement, yet still really lacked the wow factor of all those original first 3 Gorillaz albums. And then this came out. Oh, it's brilliant. It fantastically recreates all the greatness of the previous Gorillaz albums. Like they bring back the classic trip-hop style of Demon Days on tracks like Pac-Man. They bring back the more electronic focus of Plastic Beach. But it also feels very true to the newer approach the Gorillaz have taken. The featuring of artists such as Six Lack and Octavian really recreates a lot of the style of Humans. And the synth-pop heavy aspects of the Now Now are extremely present on tracks like The Lost Chord. But one of the main things about this album, the guest list. My God, if this isn't one of the greatest guest lineups I've ever seen on an album. You've got some absolute gigantic legends of British alternative music. You've got Peter Hook from New Order. You've got Robert Smith from The Cure, which I've been amazed by because The Cure have easily been the album I've listened to the most this year. And of course you have the legend that is Elton John, making an appearance on the Pink Phantom. Also, the guest list of more contemporary artists is absolutely incredible. You've got a great feature from Georgia, a great feature from Kano, and also those that are reflecting brilliant up-and-coming scenes that are on the go at the moment. You've got Afrobeat featured with the appearances of Fatoma Tadiwara, the late Tony Allen, and Moonchild Sonelli on the bonus track album. You've got Japanese punk reflected in the featuring of Chai, and the latest scene of alternative hip-hop reflected in the featuring of JPEG Mafia and Slow Tie. So, love every single creative decision on this album. They recreate some of the best bits of their previous albums while still remaining true to the new direction they've been taking in recent years, and one of the absolute greatest guest lists I've ever seen on an album. And also the fact that this is just season 1. We've got more to come. And also that brings me on to another thing. The format, the way it's done as episodes, it almost felt like the Gorillaz were releasing each track straight after they'd recorded it. So it was like you're following the album as it was being made. Like I thought they literally were just going to release it as single after single after single and then to wait until they got to the right amount to put it all together as an album. It just created a great sense of fan involvement with the artist's creative process, which I hadn't really got before with an album. And speaking of just creative decisions I absolutely love, the concert performance was absolutely out of this world. And who could forget Matt Berry featuring on a cover of Fire Coming Out of a Monkey's Head. And now on to this year's honourable mentions. With indie, you had tons of long-going indie greats finally releasing some of their greatest albums by building up years of experience and mastering their sound, such as on the latest releases from Laura Marling. and Perfume Genius. Phoebe Bridgers was the indie icon of the year. Ichiko Alba produced a brilliantly laid-back album. Fleet Foxes released another great one. Baxter Jury had some great Cockney funk. Fontaine's DC did a great job at continuing the current post-punk revival scene that's present in the UK. The legend Bob Dylan released an absolutely brilliant album, which is actually my favourite in his entire discography. I wasn't too big a fan of his before, but he finally won me over with this release. We've got the latest release from Krangbin, which is, perfectly chilled out coffee house sort of music. I was really impressed with glam rock making a brilliant revival from artists such as Declan McKenna, the Lemon Twigs at their absolute catchiest, and the sheer Bowie meets punk insanity of HMLTD. The UK jazz scene is still continuing to produce some greats, with the latest release from Moses Boyd and the brilliant compilation album Blue Note Reimagined. While the jazz scene on the other side of the pond is also doing great. Micaiah McCraven did a great reinterpretation of some of Gil Scott-Heron's later tracks. And we had the Avengers Infinity War of contemporary US jazz. Terrace Martin, Kamasi Washington and Robert Glasper all collaborating on one album. In terms of very recently created genres that became a lot more prevalent in 2020, I've absolutely loved the presence of contemporary Afrobeat on the singles chart, particularly in the releases from Burna Boy and Wizkid. Love how this genre has become very collaborative with the UK hip hop scene, and is very contemporary, but also takes its influence from a lot of the classic African musicians of the 80s and 90s. Like take for instance on the Burna Boy album, where he collaborates with Stormzy on one track and then Yosso Denoir on another. And I've also enjoyed charting the continued brilliance of the hyperpop genre, which, yes, I know hyperpop fans hate that tag, but let's face it, genre labels always emerge at some point sooner or later. It's human nature to categorise things. And also the fact that, in my opinion, it generally doesn't do that much harm. It just helps people locate things that sound similar to what they like. But yeah, so we had Charlie XCX doing a fantastic Lockdown album, and a brilliantly confrontational release from Dorian Electra, which you can tell is a LGBT anthemic album when the Village People feature. Couple this with just other great releases from the current revival of electropop. Great releases from Georgia, a brilliant return from Siguros frontman Hyunzi, a great return from Rasheen Murphy, and a brilliant new release from Yaiji. As said earlier in the video, contemporary R&B's been doing really well at the moment, particularly from Chloe and Hal, Moses Sumney, Victoria Monet, and The Weeknd, very deservingly, having the biggest selling album of the year, and so thankful to him for finally revealing to the world just how rubbish and naff the Grammys are. Along with more great R&B coming from the UK in the form of Lianne La Havas, Salt, and a really good underground release from Kea. And on to stuff that hasn't taken up a lot of my favourites, but I'm just really glad it's around, really enjoying the continued presence of alternative hip-hop in the form of Rap Ferreira and Pink Sifu and the other artists I mentioned earlier in this video, and glad to see a revival of emo rock in the form of Touche Amore, Bring Me the Horizon and Dogleg. And now just a big shout out to all the underrated stuff that came out this year, which should have got far more attention than what they did. You've got some really good indie pop coming from Japan in the form of Chelmiko and Eve, some more great goth rock music from Horror Vacui and Then Comes Silence, along with a good, more alternative-leaning Latino pop scene from artists like Melina Zavala and Natalie Lafourcade. And now, onto my number one favourite album of 2020, Poppy, I Disagree. Probably the very first album I absolutely loved of this year, considering it came out in around February, but just love as with the Gorillaz album, love every single creative decision on it, and it's just an absolute masterwork at fusion. It has a very hyper-pop style, and it's very exaggerated electropop sound on a lot of the tracks, but it's a great fusion how these will often filter into very industrial metal influenced stylings, very reminiscent of Marilyn Manson's late 1990s albums, along with the additional sonic influence of J-pop, particularly the more pop-punk end of that scene from artists like Baby Metal and Chai. And in every single track, it will start out as one thing, but then before you know it, it's gradually shifting into another. And each track takes you on this tour de force of this journey from style to style. In fact, on the opening track, Concrete, there's even a segment that sounds slightly Beach Boys inspired. But alongside this, there's also the fact this album is brilliant because something that's very rare in the streaming age, an album that sounds like it was made to be an album, alongside the great change in pace that goes throughout the album, where alongside a more hardcore metal pop fusion tracks. You'll have more laid back tracks like Sick of the Sun, which had a greater sense of pacing as you're going through it, and also the fact that the final track, Don't Go Outside, has a great callback, has a great reprisal of the opening track, which brings the whole thing together as an excellent whole. And also the fact that this album came out in February, yet it perfectly predicted the dark bleakness that we'd get in 2020. Like I said on that final track, Don't Go Outside, this apocalyptic track that sounds like one of the non-single tracks from Pink Floyd's The Wall, which has a brilliantly apocalyptic, dystopian vibe to it. And even as you said, the core lyric in the chorus, Don't Go Outside, it perfectly captures the whole atmosphere that prevailed right throughout 2020, predicting it just before everything truly broke through. So, comes together really well as an album, great fusion of styles, predicted the chaos of 2020. Additionally, there's a brilliant sense of defiance and kick-ass going right through the whole album, considering this album was the first one where Poppy has been not only broken free of her previous label, but a previously abusive producer. And of course the fact that this album just sounds so contemporary and fresh, having the darker, more eccentric, yet heavily exaggerated pop aspects from hyperpop, but also the idea of making pop that's a lot darker and grittier, similarly to with Billie Eilish's work and the pop punk from Japan. With all these factors together, it was love at first sight. Synth pop meets hyperpop meets J-pop meets 90s industrial metal in a fusion of absolute brilliance that perfectly captured the grittiness of 2020, just at the cusp of when it was all about to take place. Poppy's I Disagree is my top album of 2020. And so, there you have it, my top albums of 2020. This is a video I've wanted to make absolutely ages, and initially I did do a lot later than most other music review YouTubers have done. In fact, a lot of music review publications and online sites tend to do their best of year lists around November or December, but I decided to leave it a bit, particularly aside from being busy with Christmas, the fact that you can always get surprise album releases which you then want to include on the list. In fact, as mentioned earlier, in December you had new releases from Taylor Swift and Kid Cudi, which as a result then did not appear on a lot of best of the year lists because of not how late they were, but because of how early most critics were to just rush into it. So I decided to wait some time on this video before releasing it. Although admittedly I did at least want to have it earlier than at least do it earlier than the best tracks of the year video by Todd in the Shadows. So at least I'm not as late as he usually is. But yeah, I guess the usual stuff. Like and subscribe. You don't have to if you don't want to. I just have to mandatorily put it in. And mention in the comments what your favourite albums of 2020 have been. So, hopefully to a brilliant 2021 with more new disco and new releases from Billie Eilish to look forward to. Have a great one. Thank God, Vishnu, Buddha and Ahura Mazda that 2020 is finally over.